Welcome to Smoky Mountain Source, and today we're talking about the legend of Jonathan Swift's silver mine. Perhaps one of the greatest stories passed down from the 1700s was the story of Jonathan Swift and his lost silver mine treasure. Nearly every piece of information we have about this story comes from Swift's alleged journal, a journal that may not have even ever existed. What didn't come from the journal lived as a piece of folklore fathers told their sons. As the story goes, Jonathan Swift hailed from England, where he wrote and considered himself a businessman of sorts. While making a voyage to America, Swift would stop off at various ports as he approached his final destination, Virginia. Upon his arrival in Virginia, around the late 1740s or early 1750s, via the Chesapeake Bay, Swift wandered around the cities of Virginia. The records are unclear about which city he reached first, but a proper inference would have indicated Norfolk or Richmond. While perusing through the city streets and windows, Swift stumbled onto a man near death on the sidewalk. Swift took it upon himself to nurse this man back to health. The man in question went by the name of Monday. In a pure moment of historical coincidence, Monday held a piece of our story close to his vest. In return for helping him, Monday told Swift an extravagant story of Indians and treasure. He told Swift about a time when he was a child. Monday had been captured by Indians as a kid, and they forced him to work in a mine. Interestingly enough, this mine was a silver mine. Monday would go on and on about this cave where the silver ore could be spotted without so much as lifting a shovel. It looked as if the ore wanted you to take it. Monday never got the chance to keep any silver, but instead mined the cave for Indians for years. One fateful day, Monday escaped. On his escape route, he tried to place markers that would indicate the cave's location if he ever made it back one day. The story sounds more like the ramblings of an insane man than reality, but it goes on. Being the businessman he was, Swift saw an opportunity and jumped at it. After searching for most of the 1750s and taking patrol parties out as the weather allowed, Swift finally made a break in the case in 1760. Swift and Monday came upon one of the clues that Monday left himself all those years ago, the Turtle Rock. This rock marked the first clue in a string that would eventually lead the duo to the infamous mine. Monday's story was vindicated on the day they found the rock. After locating the mine, Swift and Monday, along with a host of supplementary team members, set up their own mining operation. Even though they had found the mine, they faced the challenge of removing the silver ore without Indians or colonists catching them mid-transport. Every year for the next 8 years, 1760 to 1768, Swift and his team mined the silver. Each time they set out to extract it, they had to take different routes. The end goal was to get the silver back to Chesapeake Bay, where Swift could load it into his merchant ship. After the discovery of the mine, his merchant fleet would increase at regular intervals in correlation with silver recovered from the mine. Business was booming. As we have learned from history, all good things must come to an end, and they did one day in 1768. Swift and his group, on their way from the mine to the coast, came under attack by Indians. It was bound to happen, and Swift was prepared. He acted quickly and hid the treasure before the Indians could figure out what this group of settlers carried in their wagons. A large amount of silver ore from Swift's mine was hidden near a large overhanging rock. By marking it with stone crosshairs, Swift knew he could get back to it one day if he survived the Indian attack. Swift and most of his mining party lived on, only to remain quiet about the Indian attack from anyone who asked, as they couldn't reveal their reasons for venturing into Indian territory. Swift's story switches from a treasure hunt to a horror story henceforth. After the Indian attack in 1768, Swift chose to listen to darkness rather than light. One night, while the entire group lay sleeping, Swift, void of emotion, violently killed them all, including 2 members of the Shawnee clan, along for the trip. Swift then made the journey back to England, where he would stay for a decade. During the years 1769 to 1790, no trip was made by Swift to retrieve the buried treasure from the Indian attack or to attempt to mine more silver ore from the cave. The mine was simply abandoned, although an unknown number of Indians knew the location of the cave. At this point in the story, the trail goes cold, and we don't hear about Swift or the treasure until Judge Haywood, a historian from the early 1800s, stumbled on something special. While researching the history of the settlements of western Appalachia around northeast Tennessee, southwest Virginia, southeast Kentucky, Judge Haywood learned of a woman named Mrs. Renfro from Bean Station. The widow of a man killed by Indians, she held the infamous journal of Jonathan Swift. Swift, shortly after meeting Miss Renfro on his travels while searching for the mine, became keen on marrying the widow. While he never tied the knot, Swift supposedly left the journal in her hands for safekeeping. The journal Miss Renfro held in her possession told the story of what happened to Swift after he killed his mining party. Turns out, Swift had a legitimate reason for not returning to grab his lost treasure and continue operations in the mines. He was stricken blind soon after his murderous rage. In his journal, Swift claimed it was Providence that blinded him, but it could have been any number of diseases. Without his sight, it seemed as if the mine was destined to be hidden by history. Jonathan Swift died before Judge Haywood would make an inquiry into the legend, sometime between 1790 and 1800. Haywood decided to make a copy of Swift's journal, and after publishing it, many Americans took their chance at the treasure. While never found, many searched for the infamous treasure. However, no one had any solid evidence as to where the mine could be. Swift's journal alluded to Big Sandy River, but that didn't exactly narrow it down. Two names that stood out on the historical record as being in search of the treasure were John Filson and Robert Breckinridge. In 1788, before Judge Haywood published Swift's journal, the duo set out to find the lost mine. Filson thought he had a solid idea of where the mine was, and he decided to enter 1,000 acres of land to search for it. His findings would be lost to history, unfortunately, as no one ever heard from him or saw him again. Before moving on, it's important to state that the story of Jonathan Swift's mine could very well just be a made-up fairy tale. Truth is, there's no actual historical proof of Swift's dealings or even his existence as a real person. Some say even the journal was created to mesh with the epic of Swift's mine. Although there's a solid chance the story could be fake, the more research, the less sure I was. Perhaps Swift wasn't a real human, but maybe his story was. By combining the folklore, Swift's journal, Judge Haywood's historical records, and a couple of other researchers of the mine story in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the information turns this story into something more than just a legend. If true, Swift's mining operations were one of the greatest secret undertakings in the world's history, but without a doubt American history. After searching, it seems as if several historical records allude to Swift and his treasure search. Jonathan Swift, from the years 1791 to 1794, bought numerous pieces of land inside the target area. South of Louisville, Swift had made purchases in Breckinridge County, Nelson County, Grayson County, and Hardin County, Kentucky. It turns out that nearly every single piece of property that Swift owned on the books, and even some of the land his friends owned, contained several of the potential known markers for the silver mine. Was Swift buying up property to not only find his lost mine, but new mines as well? At the very least, Swift's sudden purchase of land on record in the state of Kentucky could persuade me to believe he was purchasing the lands he thought held mines and more silver. But why? He had already made his money and didn't have the health to continue. During the years that Swift purchased property in Kentucky, he would regularly visit his friends who lived in Kentucky and Virginia. Among his friends, one was named Philip Marsteller. Marsteller had been a close friend of George Washington's before and during the Revolutionary War. He raised troops, became an officer in Washington's army, and then eventually moved to Virginia where he was elected mayor and lived out his days after the war. The peculiar bit about Marsteller, Washington, and Swift was that all their names appeared on one particular state document. This document set out and allowed for the designation of pallbearers for George Washington's funeral. This was a logical thing to plan as Washington had already been president and solidified his glory in American history. On the pallbearer document were Washington's name, Marsteller's name, and Swift's name. Marsteller was to be a pallbearer in Washington's ceremony, and Swift was the witness to note the contract held validity. Could this all be a coincidence? I feel like Swift not only knew Marsteller, but was most likely friends with Washington himself. Marsteller just so happened to be the only pallbearer that wasn't a Freemason. So we know that Marsteller and Washington were close friends, and Swift was possibly Washington's friend as well. So what does that have to do with our mine story? At face value, nothing, but more information would lend some mysterious clues to the link between Washington, Marsteller, and Swift. Not only did Marsteller and Swift own property around the general area in Kentucky we suppose the mine was located, but so did another friend. A man by the name of Walton owned a piece of property called Walton's Lick, where landmarks to the treasure supposedly lay. It turns out that Swift sold and distributed salt for Walton from this salt lick. Places such as Poland, Sharpsville, Tantham Springs, Brush Grove, and Powell's Trace all had links back to Swift or his group of friends. At this point, the story turned from legend to a believable story with actual documented settlers weaving in and out of Swift's land purchases. What would drive Swift's friends to aid in this cover-up of the mine? Could all of them, Washington, Marsteller, Swift, and Walton, be in cahoots over a secret mining operation? As if the story didn't already seem to be leading to something bigger than simply some treasure or a silver mine, it would now. There was another piece of land owned in Kentucky. This land was characterized by the rivers and creeks that surrounded it, effectively making it an island. The island was called Moody's Island. Normally, I wouldn't jump to the conclusion you're about to read, but in this instance, I don't think it's a stretch. Names can be easily mispronounced, and over time, they get lost and changed. What if the man Monday from our original story is really the name Moody, but over time, the letters had been changed slightly? What if I told you Swift purposely created the myth of Monday to confuse future seekers of the mine and cover up the true identity of the landmarks of the potential mines by slightly changing the location's name a few letters here or there? It would give us the answer as to why Swift's journal was so confusing and why the historical records don't know who Jonathan Swift was. Perhaps Jonathan or Swift could have been changed over the years to hide the actual location of the mines, because knowing the real name would give away which property he held. We do know that Swift wasn't the only group searching in this area of Kentucky for treasure. There's an old Indian story that confirms the existence of silver in the same land that the story takes place. The Spanish who explored this land years before Swift also told of silver in the earth. There's a mysterious rock in southeastern Kentucky filled with old Spanish writing, thought to be left over from the time the Spanish traveled through America prior to the settlers. The Spanish wrote a story that told of the existence of an old Indian silver treasure. Could this be the same silver mines that Swift and his company searched for all those years later? It would be a huge coincidence if it wasn't. As we move back to Jonathan Swift himself, there seems to be a strong connection between George Washington, Philip Marsteller, Jonathan Swift, and Walton. This fellowship, I believe, would turn out to change the course of American history forever. To put our characters in the story into context, we got to think about the mid to late 1700s. Our country's in the process of breaking off from Great Britain and attempting to start our own country. The problem is, we don't have any money or a solid line of supplies to win the war. Our only choice would be to seek the assistance of outside help. What if the entire Swift legend was a secret mining operation spearheaded by Washington himself to raise funds to win the Revolutionary War? I definitely wouldn't put it past Washington. I believe that this secret group of American businessmen aided Washington's quest to win the war by supplying him with silver that could be turned into money for his army and country. While Swift had no specific ties to America, we know that he profited greatly from selling Walton's salt, and the secret mining operation would indeed make Swift a rich man, because he would have owned a large stake in the newly founded United States of America due to his initial investment and aid to Washington. With every piece of the puzzle leading us down this revolutionary path, the end result truly changed the world. President George Washington, with the help of Jonathan Swift and his friends, secretly mined the silver ore and attempted to persuade another country to come to their aid in the Revolutionary War. That country was France. The entire mining operation turned into a massive pitch to sway General Lafayette of France into sending aid and troops to America in exchange for the precious silver ore. And it worked. Lafayette came to our aid, and we eventually won the war on the backs of the American and French soldiers and the brains of future President George Washington. So was Jonathan Swift a real person, or was he invented by Washington to run a covert mining operation to help America win the Revolutionary War? Is Swift's journal real? Does any part of his legend have truth in it? No one knows whether the legend of Jonathan Swift's silver mine is fact or fiction, but there are real records of a man by the name of Swift buying up land in Kentucky. There is also evidence that Swift's signature was used on Washington's request for pallbearers. Anecdotal evidence exists that suggests silver ore has been found near the Appalachian Mountains. It's up to you to decide if part or any of the story makes sense. However, you can certainly understand why the tale has had such long legs over the years and lasted the test of time.